Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to another episode of the Gospel according to Sage. Wait, what? Oh, sorry. Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to Coffee Talk! Wait, it's both? It's both. It's both. It's both a Gospel according to Sage and a Coffee Talk. This is the episode of the Gospel According to Sage where I lay out in chronological order my own theory of the missing years of Jesus. And for that, you might need some coffee. Because here's the thing. I'm not going to try to convince you. I'm not selling you on the idea. This is just like any other coffee talk. And, you know, it's kind of like the idea that George Soros is a vampire. Like, I know he's a vampire. I just can't prove it. So I know that these are the missing years of Jesus. I just can't prove it. Now, I proved it to myself beyond a reasonable doubt. So the coffee is mainly for y'all, because I know that many of you have been told that the reasons that we don't know about Jesus' missing years in the Bible is because A, they're not important, and B, he was just doing normal human stuff and just forget about all that. Here, look over here at the shiny thing. And if you listen to those folks, they would tell you that Jesus never did a miracle until the day he turned water into wine. And they will say to you that he just lived a normal life with his dad or his uncle or some other tall tale. But the bottom line is this: if Jesus stayed in Jerusalem, we've talked about this before, if he stayed in Nazareth, if he stayed in Judea, he would have had to have been married off, because they didn't allow you to not be married. There was only one kind of person who was not married, and those were Essenes, and Essenes are what John the Baptist was. So Jesus could have spent all his time with John the Baptist, but my research shows to me that at the day of Jesus' baptism, after his temptation, when the devil took him up on the high place and offered him the world, if he would just bow down and worship him, and Jesus refused, then he went down and was baptized by John the Baptist. To me, my research has led me to believe that there is no way that he was a regular follower and disciple of John the Baptist. That what really was the case, that John and Jesus were living what we consider, these theologians consider, parallel lives, in as far as that John the Baptist was paving the way for Jesus' ministry. And I do not believe that Jesus was in any way a disciple of John the Baptist. That Jesus pursued his own path, and his path led back to home, where his cousin, John the Baptist, had actually been doing ministry of his own, and the two ministries met on the day that Jesus was baptized. And so this is the day when the heavens open up, and God announces that Jesus is here, and it's read it. You'll love it. Read it everywhere. It's in the Synoptic Gospels. So, but I believe that was a reunited moment, that John the Baptist recognized his now much older cousin. I know how that feels. I recently went back and reconnected with my cousins in Oregon, and even though many, many years had passed, we definitely recognized each other. And so the missing years of Jesus now, as a coffee talk, we'll get started right now. We're going to do this chronologically. I want you to know before I get into this that this is after much research. I've researched this. I've been through it. I've proven it to myself beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what happened. It is too fishy that there's these holes in the gospel, that as a youth pastor, I had my students ask me, hey, Sage, how come it is we don't know nothing about Jesus' life as a teenager? I'd like to know what that was like for him. What was it like for him to get bullied? What was it like for him to deal with acne? What was it like for him to go through that awkward stage where your body parts don't seem to function right? You know, that all the stuff that plagues those teens and preteens, that we know nothing about Jesus' life, and that is very fishy to me. I think it's beyond fishy. And in fact, I personally believe I uncovered a massive multi-century, many-century long, millennia-long cover-up about the real nature of Jesus, his real ministry on this earth, and what he was doing all the rest of the time that is unaccounted for in the Gospels. So here we go. Coffee Talk, the Gospel according to Sage, the lost years of Jesus. So we start in Egypt. We know that in the Gospels, Jesus and his family fled Judea because of what's known as the slaughter of the innocents, which is where Herod had come to the knowledge that a special child had been born in Judea under the star, if you remember the Star of Bethlehem, under this sign from heaven. This infant had been born, and they knew it was a boy infant, and so Herod hunted all of the baby boys and murdered them all, according to the Gospels. Having said that, I could find no archaeological evidence that that ever occurred. I tried, I looked, I went in as a faithful person, hoping to prove that. I'm not saying it's false, I'm just saying that the Romans, if that happened, the Romans did not know of it. It wasn't recorded by them, and it was covered up out of Judaic history, which wouldn't surprise me. And the Gospels said it. I tend to believe that. However, I just had to give you that asterisk on that. But in the Gospels, we have his family and Jesus fleeing to Egypt after meeting with these sage. The Bible says magi. Some people say wise men. Some translations are different than others. When I did the research, not so much the word research from the original from the original Greek of the New Testament, but I did a historical search. And see, I tied it back to the Old Testament. You'll really never hear me preaching out of the Old Testament. I believe the old law is past and we're under a new covenant. I stay out of the Old Testament except where it's historically significant, as in this case. Many of you know the story of Daniel. Many of you know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when the children of Israel were under enslavement and captivity under Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And it was during this time that this coalition between these sages of Babylon, they call them magicians, but really they're sages, which mean wise men. These wise men, they were really more like the scientists to some degree of their time. The alchemy type science, potions, that kind of thing, remedies, things that we would now call pharmaceutical, right? Or medicinal. But also, they dealt in the stars and signs from heaven and astronomy and astrology and all of that. It was all kind of blended together into something that people now might call the mystery schools of Babylon. And that there was this meshing between Daniel and the children of Israel and this priest class with the magi, with the sages of Babylon, which that line of sages were forever changed. This is a historical fact, that the influence from the Judaic wise holy men of Israel under the captivity, when they were mixing with and living with and really studying with and sharing information with the sages of Babylon, that this survived until the time of Jesus, and it was prophesied by these Old Testament seers that the Messiah would come at that time of year when it happened, when the stars aligned, as it were, and this sign appeared in heaven as some say it's the North Star, and there's this whole argument about when that occurred exactly, but there's no doubt that the wise men knew where to be, when to be there. And that Jesus was significant, and he was in the right place at the right time, and an exchange was made with the family, information was exchanged with the family, and if you recall, they went to live in Egypt while they were fleeing from the slaughter of the innocents and hiding from Herod. They hid out in Egypt for a period of time. And this is where we pick up in the Apocrypha. Now I'm going to tell you the stories from books called the Infancy 1 and 2. Some say these are discredited books, but these books are, in fact, without a shadow of doubt, as ancient as New Testament documents can be. And the only question is, Were they at the time of the Gospels written, or were they written later on? But nonetheless, they're much older than any other theory you might have heard of, okay? That this goes back to the very early days of the church, and that this document, the Infancies 1 and 2, some people believe existed many hundreds of years potentially prior to the Council of Nicaea, where the Bible was canonized. And the Infancies 1 and 2 were considered for canonization. So here we go. When Jesus was little, their life wasn't that fun. They had to go from town to town, because one of the things that the Infancies 1 and 2 catalogs very perfectly for me is it shows what it might be like for a human child to possess supernatural power and authority that they're not quite aware of how different it is. It's like, it's really written like, what if a God incarnated on earth, and he was just there to experience humanity, but yet he had a hard time with it because at his core, he's a deity. And so one of my favorite stories is Jesus as a little child, and he's building little clay pigeons. He's making little clay figurines that look like birds. But when he builds one and he makes it and he examines it and it's perfect, then he breathes the breath of life into it, and it becomes a living bird and flies away. And some of the people see this. This is one of the reasons they have to move, because of this incident, that he was seen animating and creating out of clay birds and breathing the breath of life into them. There's another story where he comes across a dead bird, where another childhood friend kills a bird with a sling, and Jesus picks it up and blows into it and revives it and gives it life again. And then he also, later on in his childhood, he encounters a bully. And instead of fighting the bully, he just reaches up and touches the bully and the bully just drops dead. Right? He doesn't fight him, he just touches him, and the bully drops dead. And so, of course, that made some people upset, mainly the dead boy's family. So the dead boy's family come gunning for Jesus' family and go, hey, your kid just laid a finger on my kid and dropped him dead. He's some kind of witch. What's going on? You can't go around killing people. We want blood. We want revenge. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so Joseph has really got a problem. And Joseph's had it up to about here, actually, with Jesus at this point, because he's always having to flee. He's always having to run. They've just never been able to settle. They can't go home. And he's starting to blame the boy, and he realizes the boy is powerful, and he knows, symbolically, ideologically, he knows what Mary's told him the boy is. He's seen the evidence. The Magi or the sages came and told him what was going on, and he's fully aware of this. At the same time, he's still just trying to be a provider and a father figure to Jesus and to his family. And so he's trying to balance survival with all the spirituality, much like humans and normal humans do in regular life nowadays. It's always a balance between taking care of your family and serving God. I know I fell on the wrong end of that sometimes as a kid. I got the short end of the stick. We served God at my expense often, but God took care of me. And I think that sowing and reaping my family put into it is why God takes such good care of me now too, because I did pay the price. But Jesus' family paid the price for being Jesus' family. And so when this boy is killed, Joseph's had enough. And so he goes to Jesus and he goes, look, here's the deal. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of you doing this. You're going to march right down there, little Mr. Jesus. He's talking to the King of the universe, but he's still at the same time, he's being a dad. I love this from the Infancies 1 and 2. And so Joseph marches him down there and he's like, you're going to fix this. You're going to fix it right now. You bring that boy back to life. You killed him. You can unkill him. And Jesus is being stubborn. He's like, no, he's a mean boy. He was mean to me and he deserved it. And I did what I did and I'm not going to. And there's this argument and Joseph lays down the law and begrudgingly Jesus decides to, wait a minute. Before he decides to resurrect the boy, the mother of the boy gets really angry. And she reaches out to grab a hold of Jesus. And when she does, her arm withers up into a little ball like this and no longer is it at work. It's like a withered hand, and she can't control it anymore. And now she's lame in one hand. And I think the dad did something to him, and Jesus touched the dad of the dead boy, and he's blinded. So now the dad's blind. It's just havoc. It's just havoc that Jesus is raining on these people who are trying to bully him. And finally, he succumbs to Joseph's demands, and he resurrects the dead boy, and he fixes the woman's arm, and he takes the blindness off of the dad, and everything is restored. They still have to move because that was a mess. It's just really written from a dad's perspective in a lot of ways. And there is some argument that this might be the gospel according to Joseph. Because in many ways it is written kind of from a dad's perspective of what it might be like to try to raise the Son of God as a father figure and get him up to maturity. So we get a picture of Jesus dealing with a lot of the same issues that we deal with, bullies, and trying to balance this fact that he's a God in a human form on earth, and to find the balance between humanity and his godness. And I think that's not just logical, it's almost logically necessary that had to happen. I mean, if you do believe that God came down here in the flesh as Jesus and incarnated as Jesus for the purpose of getting to the bottom of our malfunctions and to save us, if salvation is the purpose, not just a sacrifice, right? Not just blood for blood, but rather a meeting of the minds, which is what the new covenant is all about, and it's why we go to Jesus with our petitions. And you know, a lot of people pray to the Father, and my Bible says that no one comes to the Father but by Jesus. So I don't really just go to the Father in Jesus' name. I go straight to Jesus. He's up there, and Jesus can take this right to his Father. Just like the illustration I gave you in a previous video, as Jesus as our defense attorney. As God sits in judgment over us, Jesus defends us because he experienced what we experienced. And I think the Infancies 1 and 2 really, really captures that in such a really great imagery. And hey, you know what? If that isn't the true story, it's so well written, why isn't that published everywhere? And to me, it helps me understand Jesus and make it more personal for me to understand him as a child, as a teenager, and now as a young adult. So we skip ahead in the Gospels. There's nothing from Jesus' birth. All this time I talked about the infancies as one of the missing holes. Then we have Jesus at his bar mitzvah. He comes up missing. This is in the Gospels. He comes up missing, and they find him confounding the wise men of the Sanhedrin Council, or the high holy men of the Jewish faith. And they were in awe of how a boy would know such things and ask such intense questions. And the net result you get from here, and this is where the trail goes cold, and I had to go into some really deep archaeological studies. I had to ask questions I had to find people who claim to have encountered Jesus and trace it back. And here's what I found was a thing called the name game. Are you ready? All of you holy name people, you know who you are. You know, you don't worship Jesus, you worship Yeshua, okay? Then you're going to actually probably appreciate this, because think of it this way. Look at the name Philip, all right? Philip, or Phil, is spelled with a PH. In Spanish, Philip is Philippe, and it's spelled with an F. You have Philippe, you have Philip, okay? In Spanish, you have Paul, right? You have Pablo is Paul. Pedro is Peter. So names vary slightly as the language interpretations change, okay? So what we have is we have Latins pronouncing Yeshua as Jesus. That's the Latin pronunciation of Yeshua. It's what you end up with when you translate it to that native tongue. And I've done the linguistic studies on this to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt for myself as a research thing on the sacred name of the holy name ideology and religion that's out there that many of you practice, and I don't have a problem with it. Now, having said that, when Jesus passes over into the east, when he leaves the area, the greater area of Judea, and in many ways kind of steps off of the Roman map, out of the Roman Empire into uncharted territories in India and later on in Nepal and Tibet, and you end up with a change in the name of Jesus or Yeshua, and they end up with Isis. The J is silent, and instead of Jesus, you have Isis. And so what you end up with is an unbroken historical document as long as you follow the name game, where he's Yeshua to the Jews, he's Jesus to the Latins, and that means to the Romans and the Roman Latin Church of later era. And then he's also, though, he's Isis to the people in the East. And this is where I found writings in Tibetan monastery at one of the most secret locations in all of Buddhism, a record there held by the monks where Jesus traveled. At the end of his journey, he ended up in Tibet, and there he wrote the Gospels for the very first time. Before he uttered them to the people in Judea, he wrote them down in a monastery in Tibet, and he left them with the Tibetan monks. And many of these teachings, known as the sayings of Isis, are part now, and have been since that time, are part of Buddhist teachings and reflections and ways of thinking. And the basics are pretty simple, and they might sound familiar to you. If your brother asks you for your coat, give him your shirt too. Don't just love your own children, love everyone's children. Just, love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. Even horrible people take care of and love their own children, right? I say love your enemy. Sound familiar? Forgive others so you can receive forgiveness. This starts to sound really very much. Isis in the Tibetan monastery sounds exactly like Jesus in Judea, right? But then there's also the archaeological evidence. There's these dotted towns that say things like, this is the well where Isis turned the bitter water sweet. Long name, but in that language it's much shorter. And it's the name of a well which a town sprung up around, which is still there to this day. There's other ones. The place where Isis cleansed the lepers. And that story was there was a leper colony in that town, and Isis, or Jesus, came through and healed all of the lepers till that was no longer a leper colony. It was a city. It was just a town of regular healed people. That's some of the biggest stories that come out of this. When you trace the character known as Isis, who clearly to me is Jesus or Yeshua, it's the same person. These are the lost years of Jesus. The reason it was covered up is that the Roman Church did not want people to look towards the East for religion. They didn't want to look towards Buddhism, or their biggest fear at that later on in the Renaissance era, not Renaissance but pre-Renaissance era, was Mohammedanism. And so anything from the East, anything that was beyond the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about in future videos, was just like taboo. And honestly, the Latins got even prejudiced against the Eastern Orthodox Church, or as we know, the Byzantine Church, later on, and the schism occurred. So, for the theology students in the room. Back to coffee talk. So, once again, just recapping here, Jesus' life spent running as a child from both the difficulties of being who he is and also being sought out by assassins from the time of his birth. He finds his way back in his probably preteen, like 9 years old. They finally make it back. I think they were in exile for 7 years. I don't recall. But his parents finally come back to Nazareth area around the Sea of Galilee. And this is where Jesus is when he is bar mitzvahed, taken to the city, and he meets with the elders, and then he takes off. I think first he goes on the trail of the wise men to Egypt, or he may have had secret knowledge given to him by the sages at the time of his birth, held by his family for him with the frankincense and myrrh. There were instructions on how to find them in the Far East, and that means like Babylon. It means over into the Indian subcontinent. Because what you don't understand, you may not understand, is that the sages of Babylon weren't Babylonian. That the sages of Babylon, the Magi, were actually from India. And they were known as Aryans. And these were pre-Indo-Aryans. And so they were some believe, red-headed, light-skinned people who originally came from the Indian subcontinent. And that even to this day, there is a line in India where people north of the line are one color and people south of the line are completely different color. And you can find skin tones in the subcontinent of India from pale white to very, very dark. And so it was believed to be that some of these light-skinned, secret magi, sage-type people from India had come to Babylon and intermingled with the holy men, and this prophecy was tied up with them. And so Jesus went out kind of seeking, to some degree, the truth about who he is and the prophecies, not just as the Jews have them, but as the sages and the magi had them, that brought them to his birth. You understand that was significant that they showed up at his birth. And so then Jesus proceeds on a trip to find his roots and find himself and perfect his message, as it were, and also to build followers, to spread the true gospel, to let people know that the age of blood sacrifice was over, that the old gods had passed away, and that now we had a new covenant with the Creator God, and it was open to all of us. And this was something he was teaching and preaching. And it was all tied up with love. It's conditional on love. The whole religion is conditional on love. It makes it different than Judaism. It makes it different than Hinduism. It makes it different than Buddhism, although Buddhism is the most touched, I think, by Christianity due to the person known as Isis's writings left at the Tibetan monastery all those many centuries ago. So Jesus finds himself in India, where at the time there were a group of holy men there, the sages, the equivalent of their sages, but they were called Brahmins or Brahmins. And these holy men, they were ascetics in as far as they, it was kind of a form of Buddhism. Buddhism and Hinduism at that point. A lot of people don't realize Buddha was before Jesus. Okay, so by the time Jesus makes his trip, he's making his trip into areas that have a worship structure based around pantheism or many gods, and that's we know as Hinduism. Okay, Hinduism was kind of mixed up with Buddhism, with Brahmanism, which actually predates Buddha. It's kind of what Buddha came up in. Buddha was first an ascetic and starved himself nearly to death. Reading the story of Buddha is very interesting. He starved himself nearly to death. A lot of people think of the fat Buddha that they see in the Chinese restaurants, but in reality, that was much later in life, and Jesus spent most of his life Buddha. Excuse me, got my peoples all mixed up. I'm not editing that, that's too funny. So Buddha lost all this weight, got super skinny because he wouldn't eat, and he just meditated all the time and denied his flesh and all of that. So that's what ascetics do. And so Jesus encounters, though, in India, these Brahmins, and it's all about reincarnation at that point. There's a lot of discussion about reincarnation, about being reborn or being born again. Dun, dun, dun! I just think it's really interesting. I keep going back and looking at that "you must be born again" scripture, especially after I tell you the rest of this. So there was an argument in Hinduism and in Brahmanism at the time that you could be reincarnated as a lesser animal as punishment for a misused life. So if you had a poorly lived life, if your life was predatory or evil in some way, that you would die and then be reborn as, say, a dung beetle or a worm or, I don't know, some other maggot creature, okay? And so there was a lot of spiritual control, not unlike the law, how they put you under the law and make you afraid that you're in danger of hell constantly and just dog you with all of this fear. Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The way of Jesus should be light and easy, and if it isn't, you're doing it wrong. That's what That's what that says to me. But they were under their own type of bondage in Hinduism, where people punished themselves. They dragged themselves on their bellies on broken glass, and they beat themselves, and they hung themselves, and they, upside down from trees, and, they starved themselves, not unlike what Buddha did at the beginning of his life and ministry, or whatever you want to call that, his religion formation. And so that's what it was like. And Jesus got into a disagreement with the religious leaders in India over reincarnation. And Jesus said, and this is a quote from the archaeological documents written about this incident at the time that I uncovered. Now, I'm not going to give you a bibliography. This is a coffee talk. You know how that goes. Do your own research. Go find it for yourself. This is meant for you to go out and look for this yourself. But beware, much of this has been removed from the internet. The internet is no longer the open source it once was, and they are removing reality from the internet and replacing it with their communist ideology. And if you don't believe that, you're just not paying attention. But I hope you can find this stuff. I looked for some of it, and a lot of it's gone, because the channels that talked about this kind of stuff got on the wrong side of you-know-who and the you-know-whats up at the you-know-where, and they got zapped off this platform. And a lot of those channels are gone in those purges, especially those early first round conspiracy theory purges. And so good luck finding those. Your best bet is probably finding archived information on the internet instead of on platforms. So look under the wwws that don't go to these major platforms. But I want you to search for this stuff. So Jesus got into this argument, Isis got into this argument with the Brahmas, with the religious leaders of Hinduism, about whether or not God would bust you down to a dung beetle. And Jesus said, and I quote, once again, I uncovered this quote. He said, "The Father would never degrade a human being by forcing his spirit back into that of an animal or a bug or any creepy crawling creature." That humanity is so far above the animals and revered by God that he would never degrade his own creation by putting the spirit of a man into a dung beetle or an animal for any reason. And that was very offensive to the religious leaders of India, and they were controlling the people and keeping them in bondage by fear of what would happen to them in the next life and to what horrible punishment they might endure in the next life if they didn't behave and do what the religious leaders told them to now. And Jesus said about freeing people from that falsehood. And that got him wanted by the theocracy at the time. Very much like what happened to him, would happen to him later in Judea, happened to him previously in India. See, Jesus was in India teaching. Of course, just like in Judea, he had followers. He had disciples, just like he had disciples in Judea. This was Jesus's method. He would go to an area like he did with with the Samaritan woman at the well, where he does a miracle with her and she spreads it to town, and they create a little enclave of followers and believers in that town of converts. And many of them will follow Jesus. Just like what happened when he freed the demoniac, known as legions, or the devils were called legions, but the demoniac was set free, and many of the people of the area were wowed by this sign and wonder, and they sat about their own little enclave of Jesus followers. And this is how Jesus always did, not just in Judea, but this is his MO from the time he leaves until we find him in Tibet, until his return to Judea, his ministry there, and his eventual crucifixion at the hands of the Jews and the Romans on the hill of Golgotha, as we know, the day he died for our sins. So he's basically going about his MO in India. And he has his followers and he has his disciples, and they put a hit out on him. The religious leaders of India, they want him silenced. They're losing control of the people. They can no longer convince the people that if they don't do what they say, they're going to end up a dung beetle. And there's all of this freedom going on, and people are no longer flogging themselves. They're not dragging themselves on broken glass. They're not, ripping their own flesh and trying to make up for their own sins so they don't end up as a dung beetle in the next life, or try to do something like that to save their children from an affliction, And Jesus is going around healing lepers and healing the blind, just like he did in Judea. And they come after him just like they would eventually in Judea, they come after him there in India as well. And there is a summons put out to bring his head to the leaders on a platter. And immediately his followers go into preserving him, and they go into saving their leader's life. And so his disciples get Jesus together in the middle of the night, and they smuggle him out of India. And then Jesus moves on, and eventually you find him in Tibet. But when he flees from there, he finds out later what happened when he left. Now, this is one of the most compelling parts of this story. So if you haven't been listening up till now, listen up till right now. Start listening right now if you ain't been listening. Okay? It's just really important that you hear this. So, Jesus fled and saved his own life. And that very much enraged the religious leaders. And when they could not find Jesus himself, they decided that his disciples were good enough. So they gathered Jesus' Indian disciples, and they brought them all together in one place, and one by one they chopped their heads off. They beheaded all of Jesus' disciples. They wanted to make sure they got it all. They treated it like a cancer. They treated Christianity in India like a cancer. And not only did they kill all of Jesus' disciples, but they hunted down all of their children and all of their wives and all of their families. And they killed them all in a mass purge that can be easily discovered. All you got to do is search it out. A holy man known as Isis was sought for death for heresy in India at the exact same time as Jesus' missing time. He escaped in the night, and all his disciples were summarily executed in a mass purge, Jesus being the only sole survivor. So now when you go back to the gospel and you look at Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, and you listen to him argue with himself or with God, or however you want to read that, when he says, God, why have you forsaken me? When he tells his disciples, get swords. If you don't have a sword, sell your coat and buy a sword. Get as many swords as you can and come with me. Stay up. Let's keep watch and pray. You keep watch while I pray. Pray with me. And they all fall asleep because they don't understand what's going on. They don't understand that a hit's been put out on Jesus. They don't understand that a price has been put on his head, that he's being sought out and hunted by the Romans for crucifixion, for trial and execution at the hands of the Jews, carried out by the Roman executioners, just as it played out in the gospel. It's all about to go down. Jesus knows it's about to go down, and he's thinking, I want to run away, but then what happened last time? I ran away. And this is when Jesus says, no greater love does a man hath than to lay down his life for a friend. No greater love does a man have than to lay down his life for his friend. And he makes the decision at the Garden of Gethsemane that this is it. He's done running. He made full circle. He went to the known corners of the universe and spread the truth as he was given it by the Father. He's done what he needed to do. He planted the seed. He can look into the future and he can see the church grow. He can see the world changed. He can even see the harvest at the end time, and he knows it is finished and he's done what he came to do. And he gives himself up for his friends so that his disciples can live on and carry his message, and it won't be snuffed out like it was in India. There's almost no fruit from the Indian ministry in Jesus, and India is under pagan control until missionaries come there in the 19th century to bring Christianity to India. I believe it's the 19th century. Could go further back than that. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a great historian about India in its colonial times, but I do believe it was brought there by missionaries much later, like thousands of years later. Okay, probably I'm thinking 1,500 years later. I don't know. I need to research what happened after that, but let's get back to the point here. Christianity did not take root any place but in a small pocket in Tibet and in Judea. And most of Jesus's work done in India was lost because his disciples were all executed. And you cannot build a religion if your disciples aren't there to carry it on after you go. It has to be intergenerational. And so there was nothing left behind. It was snuffed out. So in that moment, when Jesus could flee again and go to some other part of the known Roman Empire, maybe to the Greeks this time, and carry the truth of the gospel of peace to them, he makes his decision at this point that this is it. He's done what he came to do. He argues with the Father because he really wants to go on and keep doing this. He doesn't want the ride to be over. But he gives his life to save the lives of his disciples and to make sure that the gospel lives beyond him. And then he goes on to do what he did on Easter and his resurrection, the foundation of the church, the book of Acts, you know all the rest. This has been the history of Jesus as a coffee talk, according to Sage. Here's the thing you need to know, my friends. We are at the end of my cup of coffee, but we are also at the end of time. If this were time, we are all out of time, both figuratively and literally. You are facing a cataclysm of epic biblical proportions. We have never seen a more complicated, difficult, and confounding time to live in than right now. And I suggest that you live according to Jesus' commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. Follow the teachings of Jesus that teach you to give and to not be a taker but a giver. And don't be one of those people who Jesus says in the last day, I never knew you. You know, there's those people that thought they were Christians. They believed that they were right with God. And in the end of the book, if you go and look at what Jesus says about the last day, that they will say, you know, we did all these works in your name. And Jesus will say, but I was hungry and you never fed me. And I was naked and you never clothed me. And I was in prison and you never comforted me. And I was sick and you never came and prayed for me. So I don't know you. And then they would say, but Jesus, when? When were you sick? When were you hungry? When were you naked? When did we see you and not help you? When were you in prison? And Jesus will say, because you didn't do it for my people, because you didn't help them, you didn't do it for me. So live the law of love, treat others the way you'd like to be treated, and watch this world transform overnight. Follow the way of Jesus because it's coming down to this. Denounce the devil, embrace Jesus, and let's get on with this because you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose somebody. You either serve one side or you serve the other. You can't serve both kingdoms. You're either for him or against him. So choose now who you will serve. As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. And we'll see you next time on the Gospel According to Sage /Coffee Talk.